Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. Today is March 6th, and we are looking at again another typical criminal abortion death in that the woman did find a doctor to perpetrate her abortion. This was 36-year-old Beatrice Fisher. Now, Beatrice was 36 years old and she operated a combination gas station grocery store with her husband Lyle in Snohomish County, Washington, which is about 17 miles north of Seattle. And the couple had 3 children, ages 14, 13, and 4. Now, around 1937, Beatrice had successfully sought out an abortion perpetrated by the same Seattle doctor who had delivered her oldest child. Now, around March 4th of 1945, Beatrice informed her husband that she was pregnant and that she intended to return to Seattle for an abortion to be performed by the person who'd done the first abortion. And Lyle later reported that he wasn't happy with the plan, but it was kind of like, your body, your choice. He left it up to her. So on March 5th, Beatrice took her 4-year-old daughter and $100 in cash and drove to Seattle to seek her former physician. Now, on the way, she stopped at the home of her mother-in-law, Ethel Howard. Mrs. Howard was a practical nurse. While at her mother-in-law's house, Beatrice called a Dr. T and spoke with him about having an abortion done. And this was the first that Ethel Howard learned about the pregnancy. At some point that morning, Beatrice called Lyle and said she hadn't been able to talk to the doctor, but that the nurse at the doctor's office had referred her to a Dr. T in Seattle. So Beatrice and Ethel and the little girl went to Dr. T's office and arrived at about noon. Dr. T was not available, but the nurse gave Beatrice a business card from Dr. T that had the name and address of Dr. Frank C.J. Hart at the Joshua Green building in Seattle. So Beatrice and her companions went to Hart's office, where they found a waiting room full of women but no nurse. Later, Hart came into the waiting room and announced, 5 of you women that came in just now leave, and those that were here yesterday remain. So Ethel left with her granddaughter, but Beatrice stayed. Now, on the drive back home at about 5 o'clock, Beatrice stopped at her mother-in-law's house and said she had a severe headache and she was perspiring very heavily. Now, Mrs. Howard, following Dr. Hart's instructions, gave her daughter-in-law black tea and put a hot water bottle under her back. That was when she noticed that Beatrice's genitals were bandaged. Now, Beatrice stayed in bed for about 45 minutes, then got up for dinner with her in-laws and left for home at about 8:30, stopping at the gas station to pick up her husband. The following morning, Beatrice told her husband she was going back to Dr. Hart to have blood clots removed. She looked really tired. She took their daughter with her again and again stopped at her mother-in-law's house to pick her up. So the 3 went to Seattle up to Dr. Hart's office. Now, during this trip, Beatrice reported chest and arm pain, and her face was flushed deep red. At Hart's office again, they found a waiting room full of women, but no nurse. And again, Hart made the announcement that those who were there for the first time were to leave and the rest were to remain, and he told Beatrice to go into his office. Ethel told Hart that she was concerned about Beatrice, but he just told her, this is no place for relations and children. Meet her downstairs in the lobby. So, expecting her daughter-in-law to be ready to leave in about 20 minutes, Ethel went to do some shopping. But on returning to the building, she found a crowd of people gathered in the lobby near the flower shop. She approached the group and found Beatrice just lying dead on the floor. She had collapsed and died on the spot. The autopsy determined that Beatrice had been about 2 months pregnant. There were clear signs that somebody had performed a curettage. Her uterine wall had been gouged in several places. Clots had formed over these gouges, and the coroner concluded that one of these clots had formed an embolism that lodged in Beatrice's lung, causing her collapse and death. On March 7th, Hart was arrested. He showed authorities through his premises and gave instruments into evidence, including sponge forceps and irrigating curettes. When asked, he said that he did not keep patient records and didn't give receipts. And when the case went to trial, Hart insisted that he had only been treating Beatrice for complications of a self-induced abortion. But Lyle signed a statement saying that 2 other doctors had refused to perform an abortion, asserting that it was too risky, which would indicate that Beatrice was willing to persist in finding a physician rather than resort to a self-induced abortion. Hart was convicted of manslaughter and abortion in Beatrice's death and was sentenced to concurrent sentences of 5 and 20 years, respectively. He appealed, but his conviction was upheld, and he died at the state penitentiary in Walla Walla from heart block in 1948. And again, to put Beatrice's death in context, it was typical in that it was performed by a physician. And during the 1940s, while abortion was still illegal, there was a massive, massive drop in maternal mortality. The death toll fell from 1,407 in 1940 to 744 in 1945, down to 263 in 1950. And most researchers attribute this plunge to the development of blood transfusion and the introduction of antibiotics. So, it is really a shame that Beatrice died. It is absolutely tragic that her little girl had to see her collapse there on the floor. I really think that those 3 children would have been better off with a younger sibling than with a dead mother.